A World History of Christianity, Chapter 10, Part 3. We are on page 396. In spite of the growing number of Chinese priests in Catholic missions, the move towards a greater leadership role for them was rather slower than among the Protestant establishments. The Belgian Lazarist missionary Vincent Leb, or Lebbe, 1877 through 1940, noted in 1901, for instance, that the European clergy and Chinese priests ate at different tables in the Beijing seminary. The course of study was far less advanced for Chinese seminarians than for European clerics. The missionaries were haunted by the fear that pride would drive the Chinese to revolt, and so the great thing was to keep them in a state of humility, and of course they were expected to fill only subordinate positions in any case." Unquote. Later, Leb pleaded passionately for greater involvement of indigenous clergy in the running of the Catholic enterprise. Towards the end of the First World War, he began to send alarming reports to Rome criticizing church policy in China and demanding the separation of missions from politics, the advancement of Chinese priests, and the transfer of responsibility to them. The Vatican, having made several attempts since the 1880s to bypass French government control of Catholic missions and establish direct contacts with the Chinese government, sent Bishop Jean-Baptiste Marie Boudez de Guebriant, MEP, 1860 through 1935, on a fact-finding mission to China in 1918 through 19. As a result, Pope Benedict XV issued on 30 November 1919 his apostolic letter Maximum Illud, the Magna Carta of the modern Catholic missions, which deplored, among other things, the effects of European nationalism on the Catholic Church in China and called for the elimination of the entrenched prejudices of the Western clergy, as well as the eventual transfer of ecclesiastical administration to the Chinese clergy. From 1922, this Vatican policy was vigorously promoted by the new apostolic delegate to China, Monsignor Celso Constantini, 1876 through 1958. The lack of enthusiasm among the foreign missionary community notwithstanding, the process gained momentum with the consecration of 6 Chinese bishops, 3 of whom had been recommended by Leb by the Pope in Rome on 28 October 1926. When Leb returned to China in 1927, he acquired Chinese citizenship and started his evangelistic work at Anguo, Hebei province under a Chinese bishop. There he founded 2 Chinese religious societies, the Little Brothers of St. John the Baptist in 1928 and the Little Sisters of St. Teresa. Although Chinese Catholicism continued to be dominated by foreign priests, Chinese believers were beginning to play a greater role in the running of the church. Ma Xiangbao, 1840 through 1939, probably the most influential modern Chinese Catholic thinker, made important contributions to religion, politics, and education. He had entered the Society of Jesus in 1862 and was ordained a priest in 1869, but left the order in 1874, married, and engaged in various forms of public service. Having been reconciled with the Church and the Jesuits in 1898, he established Aurora University, now Zhendan University, in Shanghai in 1903 as China's first Catholic establishment of higher learning. Furin University, which opened in Beijing in 1925, likewise owes its existence to Ma's initiatives. Another influential 20th century Catholic was Lu Bohong, Joseph Lo Pa Hung, 1874 through 1937, a wealthy Shanghai businessman. He established hospitals and schools and in 1928 founded and became president of Catholic Action in Shanghai. He was assassinated by Chinese nationalists. Rene Liu Zhengsheng, after 1927, Dom-Pierre Celestin Liu, 1870 through 1949, was a Chinese diplomat during the late imperial and early republican years, and several times China's foreign minister. Born into a Protestant family in Shanghai, he converted to Catholicism in 1911. After his Belgian wife died, he entered a Belgian Benedictine abbey in 1927. As a result of both his diplomatic contacts and his extensive literary output, Liu was influential in promoting the cause of Christianity in China and acting as cultural intermediary between East and West. The rise of an indigenous Christian identity, including the formation of independent churches, was to a considerable extent part of the rise of a Chinese national consciousness after 1900, which found its most radical expression in the 1920s. As the tide of anti-imperialist and revolutionary sentiment increased after the May 4th movement of 1919, one of its most convenient targets was the thousands of foreign missionaries and their property and institutions still protected by extraterritoriality under the unequal treaties. The most visible parts of the Chinese church, closely allied with foreign mission operations, also came under attack by those who denounced imperialism and all its accomplices in China. Many Chinese Christians did not remain unaffected by the widespread and emotionally charged patriotic currents at this time. They demanded and indeed achieved a greater degree of participation and leadership in church affairs. It should be noted, however, that the great anti-Christian movement was relatively short-lived and essentially confined to the major urban centers. Except for areas in the control of communist revolutionaries, in many rural parts of China, Christianity was able to adapt and even flourish during the chaotic 1920s. A mission station was now rarely a target, but often a safe haven for people suffering from famine or fleeing from warlord conflict and bandit depredations. The prospects of church planting improved further during the brief period of relative stability in many parts of China during the early 1930s, following the establishment of the Kuomintang nationalist government under Chiang Kai-shek. Not that the nationalists were encouraging religious work. On the contrary, they passed laws intended severely to curtail such activities. However, preoccupation with the dual threat of Japanese aggression and communist revolution, poor enforcement, and appeals to fellow Christians in the government ensured the continuation of Christian endeavors. It should be noted that Chiang Kai-shek, after his marriage to the American-educated Methodist Song Mi-ling, had himself become a nominal Christian. The various Christian organizations were thus able to expand their routine social service operations. At the same time, rural areas in particular became the scene of extensive revivalistic movements. Another important development occurred on 8 December 1939 when Pope Pius the 12th, reversed the fateful ruling of 1715 and permitted Catholics to participate in ceremonies revering Confucius and observe ancestral rites. Thus, the way was clear for the emergence of a Chinese Catholic Church. In contrast to the countryside, church life became rather more politicized in the cities in the 1930s. In the face of Japan's aggressive advances in China since 1931, YMCA student leaders like Zhao Zixin, T.C. Chow, an advocate of Chinese Christian nationalism, not only lost confidence in the Kuomintang government, but also became critical of the Christian community's ethical approach to China's national predicament. Another YMCA leader, Wu Yaozhong, Y.T. Wu, 1893 through 1979, was even more critical of the Chinese church and favored social revolution and support for the Chinese communists as the only means of national salvation. During the War of Resistance against Japan, 1937 through 45, the Christian churches were once again endeavoring to afford relief of suffering and distress. In the early years of the war, their foreign connections gave them access to relief funds and supplies that came from the British Commonwealth and the United States. Millions of refugees were fed and housed, and many more sick or injured treated. In the Japanese-occupied areas of the country, German and French missionaries provided relief and protection from Japanese oppression. The Japanese, for their part, sought to exert control over Chinese Christian establishments and remove all other foreign influences. As a result of these restrictions, as well as the intermittent internment or repatriation of many missionaries from enemy countries, Chinese Christians had to assume greater responsibility for maintaining church life in occupied China during the anti-Japanese war. In many ways, this proved another important step towards realization of the three-self ideal. Japan, the second encounter. During the last decades of the Tokugawa shogunate, the continuing policy of seclusion and prohibition kept Japan firmly closed to foreign missionary activities. When Western countries began to press for renewed contact with Japan in the early 19th century, the implicit danger of trade and Christianity was put forward as a powerful argument against such contacts. As one apprehensive writer pointed out in 1825, when those barbarians plan to subdue a country not their own, they start by opening commerce and watch for a sign of weakness. If an opportunity is presented, they will preach their alien religion to captivate the people's hearts. Once the people's allegiance has been shifted, they can be manipulated and nothing can be done to stop it. The people will be only too glad to die for the sake of the alien God. The subversion of the people and overthrowing of the state are taught as being in accord with the God's will. So in the name of all-embracing love, the subjugation of the land is accomplished. The long period of Japanese seclusion ended with the arrival of the American black ships under Commodore Matthew C. Perry in 1853. Under the Treaty of Amity and Commerce in 1858 and similar agreements signed with other Western powers, Americans and Europeans were permitted freely to exercise their religion in Japan. In 1859, representatives of 3 Protestant missionary societies arrived, ostensibly to serve the foreign residents, but their true aim was to begin direct work among the Japanese. In 1859, the Catholic priest Prudence Girard, M.E.P. 1821 through 67, became attached as interpreter to the French Consulate General in Edo, Tokyo, while another priest settled in Hakodate. But language difficulties and the anti-Christian regulations still in force prevented much progress during the first few years. Yet it was during these difficult years that communities of hidden Christians, Kakur Kirishitan, were discovered in the Nagasaki area in 1865. Living in remote areas where government surveillance was at its weakest and where the early Christian faith had had time to send down deep roots, These communities had preserved their religion in secret for more than 2 centuries. Not surprisingly, their understanding of Christian doctrine had become corrupted in the course of time. Their biblical account, called Tenchi Hajimari no Koto, is a remarkable document incorporating both Shinto and Buddhist elements while retaining passages from the Bible with remarkable accuracy. Of the approximately 60,000 hidden Christians discovered at that time, about half chose to return to the newly introduced Catholic Church. The rest preferred to continue with their centuries-old underground tradition. Since the anti-Christian laws were still in effect, many of the newly discovered believers were imprisoned or deported to other parts of the countries, and their leaders executed. Finally, following the Meiji Restoration in 1868, the government withdrew religious sanctions and allowed the uprooted peasants to return to their homes. The majority of the inhabitants of the small island of Ikitsuki, off western Kyushu, are Kabur Kirishitan even today. During the last years of the Tokugawa shogunate, Western missionaries established themselves under the protection of the foreign powers, often resorting to diplomatic pressure and violating what the Japanese authorities regarded as an indisputable agreement about non-interference in religious matters. The aggressive spirit of the missionary enterprise naturally provoked fear and opposition among many sections of Japanese society. The missionaries' strict injunctions against idol worship brought them into conflict with traditional religious practices. The Buddhists in particular had long regarded Christianity as the fatal enemy, and did so with renewed vehemence right up until the end of the 19th century. After the Japanese government removed the notices proscribing Christianity in 1873, Christian missionary efforts, Catholic, Protestant, and also Russian Orthodox, met with some success. But in the longer run, attempts to implant this foreign religion in Japan have not been particularly successful. The converts to Protestant churches during the Meiji period were mostly individuals from the former samurai class, attracted by the non-theological, ethical, and biblical approach in the missionary presentation of Christianity. Furthermore, the missionaries, especially some Protestants, attached particular importance to education, including in time higher education. At a time when leading Japanese were generally interested in things Western, missionary teachers were often regarded as the representatives of a new and superior civilization. Early Protestant Christianity in Japan was, however, for the most part an intellectual religion for a small segment of elite that looked down on the masses, who remained attracted to Buddhism. While the very Westernness of Christianity appealed to some Japanese during the Meiji period, in time many converts felt that their new faith was unnecessarily bound to foreign organizational forms, denominational loyalties, and dissensions. Consequently, a number of independent, indigenous Christian sects came into being. The first of these bodies outside Western missionary control, the Mukyokai non-church movement, was founded in 1901 by Uchimura Kanzo, 1861 through 1930, as a religious community of the intellectual elite. However, the majority of such new bodies did not emerge until after the Second World War. Some of the more popular sects combined strands of Japanese folk religion with Pentecostal elements in reaction to Uchimura's intellectual movement. While this development contributed to the process of indigenization of Christianity among the Japanese lower classes, it was a rather unstable process. Often these groups were held together by their charismatic founders and tended to decline and split after a leader's death. Against the background of a rising nationalist spirit, aggravated by the Western reluctance to abrogate the unequal treaties, Christians made notable contributions to the modernization of the country. After 1900, the churches sponsored a variety of social and medical projects, such as hospitals, sanatoria, leprosaria, orphanages, old people's homes, etc. Christians were also instrumental in the foundation and development of the socialist and trade union movements. Yet the steady increase of nationalism during the 1930s raised difficult problems of conscience for Christians. Their refusal to participate in certain official ceremonies was interpreted as a Christian lack of loyalty and patriotism. This became painfully apparent at the time of the Yasukuni incident in May 1932, when a few students refused on religious grounds to bow at the Yasukuni Shrine in Tokyo. Although a compromise was reached, to the effect that such ceremonies constituted a civil manifestation of loyalty and reverence toward the imperial family, many Christians felt uneasy, especially during the Pacific War. With the approach of the war, the foreign Catholic bishops resigned their offices, and since that time, members of the hierarchy have been Japanese. Foreign missionaries of all churches were interned or repatriated during the war, or at best allowed very limited freedom to continue their work. Government pressure led to the formation in 1941 of the United Church of Christ in Japan, Nihon Kirisuto Kyodan, a union of some 30 Protestant churches entirely administered by Japanese. In spite of a remarkable post-war recovery, the Christian religion has not entered the mainstream of Japanese life. In the popular mind, it is still a foreign creed, preaching admirable ideas, but not suitable for ordinary Japanese people. Christian teachings are too much at variance with the more traditional patterns of Japanese thought and outlook. The present situation of Christianity in Japan is characterized in general by unobtrusive activity, with emphasis still placed on education as a means of spreading the gospel message. Korea. Korea was the last East Asian country to be opened to direct Christian proselytization. Yet ultimately it produced the most remarkable results. Being a vassal state of China, the Hermit Kingdom remained closed to the outside world until the late 19th century. As a consequence, early missionary attempts from China, Japan, and the Philippines ended in failure, and direct missionary work did not begin until the very end of the 18th century. However, Christianity did have an indirect influence on some members of the scholar elite as early as the 17th century, through Chinese language works produced by the Jesuits in China and taken to Korea by the periodic Korean tribute embassies to Beijing. The last quarter of the 18th century represents the actual formative period of Korean Catholicism. It is at this time that we first find definite evidence for the existence of a body of professing Christians and the beginning of an organized church. This period of Korean Catholicism was dominated by Confucian scholars following the line of the Surhakpa school of practical learning. Perhaps not surprising, since the Jesuits' Chinese writings included many scientific works. Many of these men were in turn connected to the Southern or Nanmin political faction, which was out of power at the time. Consequently, the formative stage of the church was dominated by the aristocracy and typified by the intellectual and scholastic concerns. However, some young scholars began to take a religious interest in Catholicism. In 1777, one group gathered in the grounds of a Buddhist temple to study the religious tracts put out by the Jesuits in China. It is to this group that the Korean church traces its origins. In 1784, one of the principal members of the group, Lee Poyak, 1754 through 86 convinced Yi Sung-hun, Peter Lee Sung-hun, 1756 through 1801, who was accompanying his father on an official mission to the imperial court in Beijing, to make contact with the Catholic priests there. While in the Chinese capital, Yi Sung-hun was baptized by the ex-Jesuit Jean-Joseph de Grammont, 1736 through 1812, and upon his return to Korea, he and Yi Poyuk began to evangelize amongst their friends and neighbors. Thus it was Korean intellectuals who introduced Christianity to Korea, not Western missionaries. In other words, from the first, the Korean Catholic Church has been a self-evangelized church. Government opposition to the spread of Christianity notwithstanding, the aristocratic members of the group began to create a church based on what they knew of the church in Beijing. A bishop and priests were elected, and these appointments remained in force for 2 years, until 1789. In that year, a letter from the Bishop of Beijing informed them that what they were doing was illegal according to canon law. Another letter in 1790 discouraged Christians from participating in the ancestral ceremonies, which caused many people to drift away from the church. In 1791, 2 cousins, Yangban converts, i.e. members of Korea's bureaucratic class, were arrested and executed for not performing the ancestral rites and for burning the ancestral tablets in their possession. These executions for belief in Catholicism set the pattern for the persecutions which were to typify the history of the Korean Catholic Church in the 19th century. It was not until 1795 that a Chinese priest, James Zhao Wenmo, 1752 through 1801, secretly entered the country and revived the fortunes of the new faith during a brief period of tacit tolerance. Whereas in 1795 there were some 4,000 adherents, the number had increased to 10,000 5 years later. However, the very growth of the foreign sect caused grave concern in certain circles. In common with Confucian scholars in China and Japan, Koreans mostly judged Christianity to be an absurd and subversive philosophy. It was condemned as a barbarous, beastly, and heterodox creed without king or parents, which destroys the state and the family. The involvement of prominent Catholic converts with the SIPA, Party of Expediency, clique, which happened to lose power in the wake of King Chongzhou's sudden death in 1800, also made the church the scapegoat for factional politics. Attacks on Catholicism became more pronounced, culminating in the bloody Sinew persecution of 1801. Many prominent Korean Catholics were killed, as well as the Chinese priest, Zhao Wenmo. As James Huntley Grayson has argued, the Sinew persecution is a watershed in Korean Catholic history, marking the end of the scholarly church of the aristocracy and the beginning of the persecuted underground church of the people. The ferocity of this first persecution was in part due to the famous silk letter sent by a young scholar, Hwang Se-yong, 1775 through 1801, to Bishop Alexandre de Beauvais, 1751 through 1808, in Beijing, appealing for a Western navy and army to compel the Korean rulers to grant religious freedom. The interception of this letter convinced the Korean authorities that Catholicism was a dangerous, heterodox creed which threatened Korea's political independence and traditional ties with China. Fearing the threat Catholicism posed to the state as well as to traditional social and religious norms and practices, the authorities launched periodic anti-Christian campaigns such as the Erhae persecution of 1815, the Chonghae persecution of 1827, and the Kaihae persecution of 1839. The last was a result of the discovery of foreign missionaries on Korean soil, which once again raised the fear of subversion by foreign powers of the Korean state. The three foreign priests, members of the missions Étrangères de Paris, had arrived in Korea, which had been established as a vicariate apostolic separate from Beijing in 1831, to minister to the Christians who had been without priestly supervision for a generation. They were amongst the many Catholics who were executed in 1839. Disregarding the hostile atmosphere in the peninsula, 12 new French missionaries entered the country in the 1840s and 1850s. The Catholic community began to grow once more, now attracting an increasing number of people from the lower social classes. However, at this time, the Western powers began to take a greater interest in the hermit kingdom as well, wishing to establish trade links. Being aware of the fate that had befallen China as a result of the Opium Wars, the Korean government rejected Western demands. Suspecting that the spread of Catholicism was part of a foreign plot to undermine the country's strict isolation policy, the Korean leaders launched another full-scale persecution early in 1866, in the course of which 9 French missionaries and some 8,000 Korean converts were slain. In response, a French naval force launched a punitive attack, but was forced to withdraw in the face of stubborn Korean resistance. However, the Catholic position improved considerably in the 1880s, following Korea's reluctant decision to establish links with the outside world. The end of isolation also gave Protestant missions the opportunity to embark on direct proselytization. The first American Presbyterian and Methodist missionaries entered Korea in the mid-1880s. Much of the success of the Protestant churches in the first 25 years after the arrival of the missionaries was due to the association of Christianity with the progressive West, to the policy of social outreach, most notably in the area of education, and to the emphasis which the first generations of missionaries placed on the responsibility of local Christians for the growth and support of their churches. In the Presbyterian case, this resulted in the formal organization of the Presbyterian Church in Korea into a self-governing, independent national presbytery by the 4 Western missions operating in Korea at that time. During the years of Japanese colonial rule in Korea between 1910 and 1945, Christianity became increasingly associated with Korean nationalism. Conflict arose from Japanese attempts to impose their own system of patriotic schools, with Japanese the national language and religious instruction and worship banned. The conspiracy trial of 1912 and the March 1st movement of 1919 both had strong Christian links. As a result, Christians were often singled out for harsh treatment by the Japanese. There are many examples of churches being burnt and Christians killed by Japanese troops. A major conflict flared up between the Protestant churches and the Japanese colonial government over the question of compulsory attendance at services of worship at Shinto shrines to honor the Japanese emperor and his divine ancestors. The Catholic Church seems to have more readily acquiesced in the Japanese attempt to impose Shinto nationalism on the Korean nation, but many Protestant ministers and laymen were imprisoned and foreign missionaries deported for their refusal to support the Shrine Edict. 1945 onwards. The rise of nationalism since the late 19th century notwithstanding, the Christian enterprise in East and Southeast Asia continued for long to be dominated by foreign missions. However, the Second World War initiated a process that brought about decolonization and the elimination of the more direct forms of imperialist domination throughout the region. Asian Christians now had the opportunity to free themselves from colonial and missionary domination and engage in independent Christianization. During the early post-war decades, church growth was particularly encouraging in Korea, Taiwan, and Hong Kong. More recently, other parts of East and Southeast Asia experienced a growing interest in Christianity, mainland China being the most remarkable case. The Chinese church under communism. When the anti-Japanese war ended in August 1945, the resumption of vigorous Christian proselytization was anticipated. Chinese Christians were to assume greater responsibility in this work. To this end, the Catholic Church established an ecclesiastical hierarchy in China in 1946. 20 ecclesiastical provinces were erected. The vicariates and prefectures were raised to dioceses, 20 of them to archdioceses, and the ordinaries, many of them Chinese, were made bishops or archbishops, respectively. Bishop Thomas Tien, SVD, 1890 through 1967, of Tsingtao, became China's first cardinal and was soon afterwards appointed Archbishop of Beijing. However, implacable opposition to communism and Rome's decision to back the Kuomintang during and after the Civil War, 1946 through 49, precluded any accommodation with the CCP. While the communists had tolerated Christians and missionaries during the anti-Japanese war, their attitude changed dramatically after 1945. In the communist-controlled so-called liberated zones, anti-missionary struggle meetings were organized, mission stations materially ruined, and foreign missionaries routinely accused of certain crimes. Among other things, the old xenophobic tales of child murder and mutilation of children's bodies for evil purposes were revived and circulated in inflammatory placards and newspaper reports. After the communists had gained control of state power in 1949, these campaigns were extended to the entire country. With the governmental decree of 23 June 1950 on the suppression of counter-revolutionary activity, began the systematic struggle against the church. By 1954, most foreign missionaries had been expelled from the country, often after ignominious show trials, mistreatment and imprisonment, and the confiscation of foreign-run establishments. Since missionary activity had become impossible on the Chinese mainland, a significant number of the foreign personnel were redeployed to work in Taiwan, Hong Kong, and amongst the Chinese diaspora in Southeast Asia. However, ideologically and organizationally, the Catholic Church in particular continued to constitute an implicit challenge to the Chinese state, even after the elimination of the foreign missionaries. Eric O. Hansen writes, "The People's Republic considered the latent Catholic political opposition much more serious. Catholicism threatened to block effective government penetration, regulation, and control of its organization. The new government demanded not only the public obedience of key church figures, but also their sincere, total allegiance. This demand, of course, followed the Chinese political tradition, but the communists had the will and the means to pursue this objective with greater force than Ming or Qing dynasties. To this end, the CCP's Central Committee, in January 1951, established the Religious Affairs Office, later Bureau, staffed with specialists to oversee religious affairs, its function being to penetrate, regulate, and control religious organizations. To this end, the government sponsored the Catholic Three Self movement of 1950 through 51 to establish a self-governing, self-supporting, self-propagating church free of all foreign influence. The state obtained its objective with the establishment of the National Patriotic Catholic Association, now known as the Chinese Catholic Patriotic Association, CCPA, in 1957, and the consecration of government-sponsored bishops in 1958. Officially, the Chinese Catholic Church had severed all links with the Vatican. In contrast to the belligerent anti-communist stand of the Catholic hierarchy, many Chinese Protestants welcomed the communist victory and were actively involved in setting up a national church body in 1951, for which the name Three Self-Patriotic Movement, TSPM, was adopted in 1954. It is nominally an autonomous organization that is co-opted and utilized by the state to eliminate foreign influence, unite Protestants in one organization, and promote CCP policies within the church. Many of its leaders had been active in the YMCA and YWCA in the 1930s and 1940s, including the highly controversial Wu Yeozong. In spite of the willingness of many liberal Protestants to cooperate with the communists, oppositionist sentiments prevailed amongst more conservative elements. Many of the indigenous Protestant sects and charismatic evangelical leaders, in consequence of the dissolution of denominational structures, resisted coerced unification or collaboration with the new state. In response, the TSPM organized a series of denunciation campaigns against unaffiliated groups and individuals in the 1950s. Zhao Zizhen, Jing Dianying, Wang Mingdao, and Ni Toushen Sheng were some of the prominent victims. Indeed, the period from the mid-1950s to the late 1960s was a time of great suffering for Christianity as a whole. The nationwide mobilization campaigns, such as the Great Leap Forward, 1958 through 60, and the calamitous Cultural Revolution, 1966 through 69, in particular, adversely affected the Christian churches. Bob White has aptly described the impact of the Cultural Revolution on the faithful as follows. All religious personnel were forbidden to engage in religious activities, and many were subjected to abuse and ill treatment. Such abuse was conducted on an arbitrary basis, and it was much worse in some places than in others. In the early stages, many clergy and also lay believers had their homes ransacked, their religious books taken and burnt, and their movements and activities watched. As social chaos mounted, so the tides of the factional struggles could sweep up people on a random basis. Priests, pastors, Buddhist monks, imams found themselves sharing in manual labor with intellectuals, Democrats, and disgraced communist officials, including the former cadres of the religious affairs bureaus. This shared suffering was to influence the future attitudes of many in more tranquil times. There is no doubt of the suffering experienced by Christians during these long years, but Christians were by no means the prime targets of the persecutions. These terrible events led many outsiders to believe that Christian faith was doomed in China. Yet by the late 1970s, it became clear that it had survived, essentially in the form of clandestine underground churches and family prayer meetings. Since then, an explosive growth of Christianity has occurred in many parts of the country. This so-called Christianity fever has been particularly prevalent in Chinese Protestantism. Exact figures are difficult to establish since many Christians do not wish to register with the TSPM because of the latter's close collaboration with the government. Similar problems exist between the official Catholic Church, regulated by the CCPA, and the pro-Rome underground movement led by the so-called little black priests. Yet, in spite of these divisions, the tight control exercised by the Religious Affairs Bureau and sporadic bouts of harassment, the Catholic and Protestant churches continue to grow. Post-colonial Southeast Asia. In Southeast Asia, Christians played at best a marginal role in the liberation struggles and nation-building processes after the Second World War. For one thing, Christianity was the religion of outsiders, that is to say, Europeans, Indians, and Chinese. But as the Malaysian experience has shown, independence was seen as a Malay, and thus a Muslim rather than a Christian issue. In areas where Islamization has intensified in recent decades, for example, in Aceh, Muslims are demanding government intervention against Christianity. In such localities, contextualization is in any case virtually impossible. Similar cases could be made with respect to Buddhism domination in the post-colonial nation-states of Burma and Thailand. In other independent countries of Southeast Asia, the greater centralizing efforts of post-colonial governments are threatening ethnic minority groups and the residual autonomy of tribal communities. It was among the ethnic minorities on the peripheries or margins of centralizing colonial states that modern forces were first introduced in significant ways as part of the missionizing effort. From the late 19th century, Protestant missionaries brought communities like the Karen in Burma and the Batak in Sumatra into contact both with Christianity and, through mission schools, with the modern world. Yet in the newly independent states, the existing Christian infrastructure amongst minority peoples, often with separatist tendencies, is perceived to undermine state control. In spite of these many obstacles, Christianity has experienced further growth in Southeast Asia. Concerns about the rise of communism, the victory in China, the emergency in Malaya, the conflict in Vietnam, induced many diaspora Chinese to join the church. In this connection, following the government's attack on communism in 1965, the growth of Protestantism has been quite remarkable in Indonesia. In Malaysia, these developments have given some impetus to the formation of an ecumenical movement and regional Christian association. But cultural diversity and ethnic identity have also produced greater denominational fragmentation. In particular, Chinese-speaking congregations have preserved a strong sense of autonomy, as have the immigrants, including the Mar Thoma and the Syro-Malabarian Christians from India. At the same time, many local Chinese and Indians have joined groups associated with rapidly expanding charismatic Christianity. For Vietnamese Catholics, the post-war experience was rather tragic. In the past, Catholics, a minority of 10 to 15% of the population, had, with some exceptions, remained aloof from the nationalist and anti-foreign sentiments that had inspired the non-Catholic majority. Vietnam's declaration of independence following the Japanese surrender in August 1945 gave them the opportunity to prove their patriotism. Indeed, Catholics supported and served in the short-lived communist-dominated Viet Minh government, but in time the communists initiated a program designed to gain them undisputed domination of the country through the elimination of non-communist resistance forces. Initially, the strongly Christianized area around Phat Diem and Bui Chui Chu in northern Vietnam retained their special administrative status under Bishop Li Hu Tu, 1897 through 1967, who was also a member of Ho Chi Minh's government. However, anti-Catholic harassment increased, culminating in general anti-Christian persecution in North Vietnam following the division of the country in 1954. This caused between 600,000 and 800,000 Catholics to flee to the south. This large influx of Catholics strengthened the newly formed southern government of Ngo Dinh Diem, a devout Catholic and ardent anti-communist. These refugees became the most enthusiastic supporters of his increasingly ruthless dictatorship. While the official church hierarchy was rather prudent in its relations with Diem, this cannot be said of Bishop Ngo Dinh Thuc, the brother of the president. At the same time, Vietnamese Catholics held a disproportionate number of official posts in the national and provincial governments, as well as in the army. The privileged position of Catholicism and its attendant triumphalism, in turn, alienated the majority Buddhists. Indeed, it was the Buddhist crisis of the summer of 1963 that contributed to Diem's fall in November of that year and the subsequent settling of accounts with the Catholics. Although the South Vietnamese Church recovered from the crisis, Christians experienced a new setback following the communist victory and reunification of the country in 1975. South Korea. During the immediate post-war years, local Korean churches in the American-controlled South began to play a significant role in providing social services and rebuilding institutional facilities. This was necessitated by the influx of Christians from North Korea as a consequence of the severe suppression of Christianity by the Russians and the Korean communists. On the eve of the outbreak of the Korean War, a large number of Catholic priests and believers were arrested, imprisoned, and executed in the North. The subsequent Korean War, 1950 through 53, had, of course, an even more devastating impact. Nevertheless, church membership continued to grow in the South, as many Koreans looked for new certainties during and following the terrible ordeal. It was, however, in the 1960s that spectacular church growth commenced. This decade saw the expansion of social and evangelistic outreach involving projects such as urban industrial mission, work with prostitutes, the development of Korean missions overseas, and provision of relief supplies to foreign countries. Church membership has continued to grow, and today nearly 1/5 of the South Korean population is Protestant. The Catholic Church also experienced rapid growth after the end of the Korean War. By 1962, membership had increased to 575,000 from 166,000 in 1953. At the same time, it began to change from a rural ghetto church to one part of the mainstream of Korean society, and Catholics have shown greater social concern than in the past, supporting students' protest movements and demanding social justice for Korean workers. Moreover, the Second Vatican Council created the conditions for cooperation with other Christian churches in Korea. The new ecumenical spirit became particularly evident in the joint struggle of liberal church leaders against the undemocratic military authoritarianism of Presidents Park Chung-hee, and Chun Doo-hwan. The phenomenal growth of Christianity has in recent decades been accompanied by three tendencies: fragmentation, indigenization, and the rise of syncretistic sects. The Presbyterian Church of Korea, for instance, split into four major groups between 1952 and 1959, and since then these four bodies have further fragmented into 87 different Presbyterian factions. While little attempt was made until recently to adapt Christianity to Korean culture by removing, for instance, non-essential Western accessories, there are now indications that elements of Korean folk tradition are coming to the fore in Christian religious practices. One increasingly prominent characteristic of church life are the faith-healing services, often in connection with revival meetings, including features reminiscent of shamanistic practices. Moreover, charismatic preachers tend to emphasize the blessings of temporal prosperity in this life in their sermons. The related phenomenon of newly emerged religions, that is to say, syncretic religions, constitutes another noteworthy aspect of modern Korea. The two major examples of syncretic sects with a high Christian content are the Olive Tree Church, founded by Pak Tae-san, and the Holy Spirit Association for the Unification of World Christianity, Unification Church, or Moonies, founded by Moon Sung-myung. Concluding comments. It is remarkable indeed that Christianity, following severe persecution in the 19th century, has become the predominant religious movement in South Korea at the end of the 20th. Christians have proved themselves adequate to the task of self-support, self-development, and survival under harsh conditions of foreign, colonial, and indigenous military rule. In this respect, the Korean experience appears as a significant departure from the predominant pattern in East Asia. Christianity struggled for centuries to gain a foothold in the face of strong states everywhere attempting to penetrate, regulate, and control institutional religion. Confucianism, primarily the Neo-Confucian Zhu Zi philosophy, with its static view of social life and its emphasis on loyalty and filial piety, provided the official philosophy and contributed to the stability of intellectual life in China, Korea, Japan, and Vietnam. It dominated all levels of intellectual and social activity of the government and the ruling class, and regulated the pattern for social relations and family life. Foreign religion influence was tolerated only during periods of social, economic, and political crisis. The more the old legitimacy failed to provide security and sustenance, the more people were disposed to accept both universal religions and heterodox sects. But as soon as strong central power was reestablished, the state set out once more to regulate and control the churches, as occurred in modern times in Meiji Japan, in Taiwan after 1949, and even in South Korea, but most powerfully in the People's Republic of China. Hansen has argued that this was one of the most enduring aspects of the Chinese polity. The Chinese politico-religious culture discourages independent religious organizations. The difficulties of the Catholic Church in the People's Republic are not primarily due to Peking's Marxist ideology, but to the re-emergence of a strong Chinese state with a continental as opposed to a more open maritime political ideology. Yet, the iron hand of the communist state notwithstanding, mainland China has experienced a remarkable revival of Christianity and phenomenal growth during the last 20 years, within both officially recognized church organizations and unaffiliated autonomous communities. Estimates for 1996 put the number of baptized Protestants at 33 million. Chinese government estimate 19 million. And of Roman Catholics at 18 million. Government estimate 6 million. Seen in the context of China's enormous population, even on the basis of the higher estimate, Christians, Catholics, and Protestants account for only 4.3% of the total. However, this is a significant increase over the 1% in 1949. Moreover, in the global context, Chinese Christians represent a significant component of world Christianity, especially when fellow Chinese believers in Hong Kong, Taiwan, and the Southeast Asian diaspora are taken into account. Similar revivals have also been noted in other parts of the region, including Indonesia, Malaysia, and Singapore, where Pentecostal and charismatic currents have been particularly powerful. The vitality of Korean Christianity has already been noted. At the higher echelons, international ecumenical and interdenominational structures have been established, but with little progress at the grassroots, which are encouraging the emergence of an Asian form of Christianity, with an intra-Asian cross-cultural apostolate. A significant step towards an Asian theology was taken in the mid-1970s, when an indigenous Korean theology began to develop among Korean Protestants overseas and imprisoned theologians in Korea. This led to the emergence of the distinctive Minjung Singhak theology of the people. Reflecting the experiences of urban workers, especially during the years of oppressive military rule, the focus of Minjung theology is on the politically oppressed, the economically exploited, and socially alienated. Thus, it has much in common with Latin American liberation theology. In spite of these many positive developments, Christianity faces a number of problems in East and Southeast Asia. As far as China is concerned, the process of improving Sino-Vatican relations has been painfully slow. This in turn has prevented the coming together of the official and underground churches. At the same time, the severe shortage of priests has placed great responsibility on the laity not only in China, but also in the Philippines, Protestant churches are facing similar problems. The re-emergence of denominalization in China, this development explains in part the persistence of unregistered house churches and church affiliation along ethnic lines, especially in Southeast Asia, hamper moves towards greater unity and cooperation. Moreover, rapid Christianization has also encouraged certain sectarian tendencies, extreme doctrines, and immoral practices. Nevertheless, if some of the internal and external problems can be overcome, Asian Christianity as a whole may well emerge as a major force in world Christianity in the 21st century. This concludes Chapter 10.